the new program year, and we're glad that you're here. Let's open with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let's pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, where there is darkness, light, where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Thank you all for being here, and by the show of your presence and the number of people here, it seems like forgiveness is something that has our attention, that perhaps is difficult for us, and yet we know we're called into it. And so how do we work into a life of forgiveness, of being forgiven, of forgiving, of understanding God as a God of forgiveness, of understanding who Jesus is and who he called us to be? We'll use all of that as a backdrop, but this is primarily a practical series, beginning tonight and continuing on the next 2 Wednesdays. Mostly practical in that what I've tried to do in my reading is to glean certain wisdom as it relates to forgiveness, and hopefully share it in a fairly systematic way that you can pull out what you want, you can tease out, and you can develop the practices that you will find helpful with it. I don't know that there's any great secrets to be gleaned here. I think it will all make sense as it unfolds. And yet, it is countercultural, it is counterintuitive in so many ways. And yet, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, it is the only way to peace, to practice forgiveness in our lives. And so with that as a kind of an overview, let me highlight. We're going to talk about why forgive, what it is and what it is not. It is an invitation to practice a particular model that we're calling the fourfold path to forgiveness, to move away from a revenge cycle and into a path of forgiveness. And I'll give you a little bit of teaser tonight on that later on this evening, but we'll devote a lot of time next week to that fourfold path. We'll ask the question how we might approach the most difficult and challenging opportunities for forgiveness. And I say opportunities in quotation marks there because we may not always feel that they're that way, right? And then how to practice forgiveness of oneself is an important part of this. I have 2 presuppositions to put forth to you, and we can disagree on these, but it is premised on what I believe is our orthodox understanding of who God is. That God is a God of consummate love, which means that God is steadfastly merciful, and that God is therefore always yearning to be in the path of forgiving experience with all of us and with all creation. And with that as the backdrop, if that is who God is, then there is nothing or no one in all the world that cannot be forgiven. That's presupposition 1. And there is no one who is inherently undeserving of forgiveness. Now, does that stop anyone short? Maybe some of us have people in our lives that it's just really hard to see how forgiveness is a part of the work to do in that. We'll talk some about that. We'll also talk about the very important and necessary distinction of renewing a relationship in the wake of forgiveness or releasing the relationship in the wake of forgiveness. And very importantly, we're not asked to put ourselves in harm's way as a work of the forgiveness. All right? So let me begin with, and let me just go ahead and claim I don't have an original thought in my head. It all comes from the reading of people wiser than me, and Desmond Tutu, I count chief among them. He has been living and practicing this work of forgiveness day in and day out for decades. And if anyone had reason and cause to not forgive people who have done him and his people wrong, certainly he is one among us. And yet he says, again, there is no peace to be had without the forgiveness, the work of forgiveness. So I want to begin with a story that he tells, told in one of his books 20 years ago, out of his experience with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We all know that experience in South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation, where the work of listening, of dignified hearing, is the language he uses, was not to prosecute and punish the perpetrators of the violence of apartheid, but rather to create settings in which perpetrators and victims of the violence could hear one another's stories so that healing and forgiveness might be possible. And so he tells the story of a South African woman who is in the Truth and Reconciliation courtroom. It was a courtroom. It wasn't functioning to punish an individual. So no one was on trial. It was to listen. And she was there as a victim of the heinous crimes done to her family. She, let me just read a segment from his book, No Future Without Forgiveness. Tutu writes, Officer Van de Breck was a police officer who acknowledged that along with others, he had shot this woman's 18-year-old son at point-blank range. He and others partied while they burned the son's body, turning it over and over on the fire until it was reduced to ashes. 8 years later, Van de Breck and others returned to seize her husband. She was forced to watch her husband bound on a woodpile as they poured gasoline over his body and ignited the flames that consumed him. The last words she heard her husband say were, "Forgive them." Now Van de Breck awaited judgment in the Truth and Reconciliation setting, and the commission that was there asked the woman what she wanted, and she said, "I want three things. I want Mr. Van de Breck to take me to the place where they burned my husband's body. I would like to gather up the dust and give them a decent burial. Second, Mr. Van de Breck took all my family away from me, and I still have a lot of love to give. Twice a month, I would like for him to come to the ghetto where I live and spend a day with me so I can be a mother to him. Third, I would like Mr. Van de Breck to know that he is forgiven by God and that I forgive him too. I would like to embrace him now so that he can know my forgiveness is real." And as the elderly woman was led across the courtroom toward him, Mr. Van de Breck fainted, overwhelmed. Powerful story, isn't it? How do we begin this engagement? And I think if we can always go back to the scriptures, this is not going to be a Bible study. It's not going to be a recitation of literally hundreds of references to the work of forgiveness in the scripture. But Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, is very clear in saying that the way to God is the way of forgiveness. That if we press that, we cannot know God without the work of forgiveness being a part of that journey. Forgiveness is not simply a generous attitude. I'll just kind of let them go on and be in their life the way that they need to go. The problem is that we live in a world of commodification, that scorekeeping in our relationships is a very real challenge for us. If Christopher does me wrong, I remember that, and then I want to retaliate and do him wrong. He does one, I scorekeep back. And the scorekeeping is the challenge for us, where nothing is ever forgotten. It's a world of despair because we are locked into an old behavior. And this new possibility can only happen in a world in which there is the forgiveness, when an act of inexplicable generosity stops the vicious cycles of resentment and revenge. Now, if you want to know all the citations of forgiveness in the Bible, email me and I will give them to you. It will be several pages long. Suffice to say that there are manifold references to God's forgiving of humanity, to God's forgiving of individuals. There are manifold citations of Jesus forgiving or teaching forgiveness. We'll spend a little bit of time, maybe tomorrow, next week, but probably the third week, talking about some of the parables. Parable of the prodigal son probably being the one that we're most familiar with. But there's all sorts of passages in which we're called to forgive one another. And so we don't get it off without doing it. We must be honest with ourselves, though. And if you want to read, you can read any of the books that are listed on the bibliography in the last page. And any of them, I think, will be well worth your time. But if you want to read the little one that will take you an hour to read, it's about 70 pages long. It's Walter Brueggemann's Spirituality of the Psalms. It's not specifically about forgiveness, but it's about all the different layers of life and how we're called into being as people of faith in reference to this God. But what he says, and I've taught here on more than one occasion when Brueggemann calls it the costly loss of lament in our time. We have lost the ability and the practice of lamenting when things are not right. We can complain, we can get angry, but the lament is saying to God and to one another, this is not right, and we want it differently. And what Brueggemann suggests, and I would propose to you, is that without lament, we will not know how to forgive. Without the ability to really name the truth, to speak the truth, including naming the hurt that is done, that is experienced as a result of the broken relationship, of the betrayal, of the mistrust, of the wrongful deed, we will not know how to forgive without being able to express that lament. So that's why I suggest this beautiful little book, because it helps us understand that we cannot delude ourselves into just saying, forget about it, or it's not a big deal, when it really is. Our hearts and our souls will not let us off that easily. It also protects us from exposing ourselves to people who aren't safe. If the lament is saying, I cannot be in relationship with you when you are doing that, then it's a protective barrier, a boundary, a healthy one for us to understand. So why should we forgive then? Well, the premise is that we are all broken. And if we are all broken, then sooner or later we are going to hurt one another. Is there anyone here who has never hurt another? Never done something that warranted being forgiven? Anyone willing to raise their hand? Let the record show no one raised their hand. We live in this world as broken souls, and we know what it is to hurt one another. And so a part of this work is acknowledging and honoring our shared humanity, even if we can't continue the relationship in an active way. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But forgiveness is the path to healing. Tutu says it's your best self-interest you could ever have is to work on forgiveness for your own sake. Don't worry about the other person and what they need. Just do it for yourself. The best self-interest you'll ever have. It's also the premise, and again, we can disagree or debate it, but I think there is no future of peace without forgiveness. We will not find it globally. We will not find it societally. We will not find it in community. We will not find it in our individual relationships if we are not able to practice forgiveness. We will not find peace. And I believe that we all and every human that's ever walked the face of the earth longs for peace. I believe we're hardwired to long for it. We just don't know always how to get there. Revenge and retaliation is what we're acculturated to, naturally enough. But those practices, those habits, rarely satisfy us. There was a time when I was doing prison ministry back in Arkansas, and we would occasionally meet with people who were on death row. And I had occasions, a few times, to meet with family members of people whose loved ones were killed by the one on death row. And almost to a person, I think the science will show that they don't get satisfaction when that person is executed. We want revenge, we want retaliation. That's a writ large description or example. But there is this invitation for us to step out of that path of retaliation and revenge and to do it differently. We forgive for our own sakes primarily, not dependent upon the action of the other. So this is, again, it's hard to think about, well, how do we forgive someone who's not repentant? And it may mean that the relationship cannot be renewed. It has to be released. But the work of forgiveness is for your own sake. Because as long as you are unwilling to forgive that person who has wronged you, you are connected with them. You're always going to be connected with them anyway. But you are going to be connected with them with all of the energy that isn't peaceful as a result of the lack of forgiveness. Does this make sense?
Yes.
I see nodding heads, but do you think that that's hard work? Yeah. So let me just hit highlights on there is a whole, in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been this burgeoning science of forgiveness. And there are all sorts of studies that demonstrate that forgiveness has positive health impacts. Lowers blood pressure, lowers anxiety, lowers depression rates, lowers anger rates, decreases incidence of somatic symptoms like backaches, stomach aches, headaches, and so forth, insomnia. It increases hope in a sense of spiritual connection to something larger than ourselves. It correlates with higher emotional intelligence too. There's another study for that. I didn't cite all of those, but if you want some of them, I can dig out those citations for you. I've taught here a few years back Martin Seligman's work out of the University of Pennsylvania on positive psychology, and the more we practice the positive emotions of things like joy and hope and love and so forth, the happier we are. Happy not in an emotional way, but happy in the sense of a higher sense of well-being in our lives. Human Flourishing is Seligman's latest book, and I would recommend it to you if you're interested in that. Donna Hicks is a woman who teaches at Harvard University. I had the opportunity to spend some time with her several years ago before I moved here. She is the director of the international program that does mediations between countries in conflict. So like she goes to Israel, Palestine, or she goes to India, Pakistan, and so forth. She was meeting with a group of us clergy, and she's written a book, and it's entitled Dignity, and she says that what we understand in the science is that when we forgive one another, both experience dignity more than if we don't forgive. Does that make sense? Seems intuitive enough, but it's important work. She also says, I think I have this later on, she also says that the part of the brain that is activated with a psychological injury or harm is the same one that's activated with a physical injury or harm. Ubuntu is the term out of South African culture that understands that there is no individual I, that all of humanity is connected and interconnected. And Archbishop Tutu, in one of his other books, says, when someone asks me, how am I doing? he says, we are well. Because there's no way that he can answer, I am well. We are well. It's a notion of Ubuntu. There are sociological and theological considerations to be had here. No one is born a criminal. Can we agree on that? No one comes out of the womb ready to be handcuffed and locked away. No one is born cruel. Now, having said that, I would say that there are pathologies, personality disorders primarily, that can exhibit cruelty. Antisocial is probably the one most prominently inclined toward that. So we're not talking DSM pathologies here. We're just talking no one comes out of the womb cruel. It's a learned behavior. Okay? Does anyone want to disagree with that? It's okay if you do. We profess the faith that all humans are created in the image of God and therefore have an inherent goodness. But do we really believe that in the way that we engage one another, especially when our relationships are broken? And then lastly, what guides us in our understanding and in our relationships? Is it the inherent goodness in both in the relationship? Or is it that we come at it from a point of depravity? That there is a wickedness in all of us, which there is. But is it that which guides our understanding? Or is it the first? And when is betrayal the thing that might flip the thing for us? Does that make sense? It's all questions. The caveat here again is that this is not a directive to stay in an abusive relationship. Okay? Any questions thus far or comments? Yeah, Kathy?
Would you please repeat that sentence you just said about when is betrayal, when it makes the situation flip?
So our theological doctrinal teachings about the human condition is that we all have the capacity for good and we all have the capacity for evil, right? And what informs our relationships primarily? Is it our inherent mutual goodness, or is it a disconnect out of the wickedness, the depravity, or the capacity for evil? And perhaps it might be one side of the coin for a time until or unless betrayal happens. And then there's the mistrust that says, I'm not sure that I'm seeing the goodness there. So it's a struggle. But the question then that leads from that is, how do we go back over to that other one and recognize that we have a shared humanity still that has something in common for us? But again, having said all of that, this is not telling, let me just name a specific example. This is not saying to a woman who is being abused by her husband, you should stay in that marriage at all costs. Or forgive him. That's not what we're talking about, right? The work of forgiveness may be the victim's work. We'll say more about that a lot more next week, for their own sake. But it may be in the context of, it has to be in the context of revising the relationship. Either renewing it in a new way that comes in with new understanding and safety, or releasing the relationship where we're not going to be in an active engagement. All right? Yes?
Could you explain what you mean by all are created in the image of God?
Yeah. Is that language familiar to you at all?
Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of language that's familiar to me through my faith experiences, when I start thinking about it, I find myself not really knowing what it means.
Yeah.
Or what's it mean.
So probably the simplest way that I would describe it, there's a whole theological treatise on the imago Dei, the image of God. But we know the creation story in which God creates all that is, including us. And God looks at it and says, it is good. Right? There is an inherent goodness embedded in every element of creation as a part of God's design. And that goodness, we say, is reflective of God's nature. And that's where we say in the image of God, that there is a connection between God's goodness and our goodness that enables us to celebrate it as a gift to all of us. And the challenge with that is that Adolf Hitler had that inherent goodness in him as well. Or, fill in the blank of whoever you think is so evil that it couldn't possibly. Doesn't mean that they didn't go off the rails, but that there is the inherent goodness. And so, if that's the case, this is where we're going, is there anyone that is not worthy of being forgiven? And my proposition to you, back to those two presuppositions, is that the answer must be no, that everyone is that the opportunity to forgive anyone and everyone exists as our work today. That's hard. And I sense some unsettledness in the room because I know that many people here, I know some people because they have shared their stories confidentially with me, but I would suspect that there are many people here for whom betrayal in an intimate relationship has really rocked one's world. Your world. I'm not speaking to anyone here in particular right now. And to suggest that there is forgiveness and then relationship to be had with the person who did those terrible things is really troubling. I want to just name it and acknowledge it. Ben.
So is it possible to forgive the act of that person?
He asks, is it possible to forgive the act but not the person? Could I turn it around and say, is it possible to forgive the person and not the act?
Harder.
Yeah? Why is it harder?
Because when we experience harm, we experience it interpersonally, right? We associate the person with the act, and so it's hard to extricate the person.
Yeah, he's saying because it's hard to extricate the person from the act. Yeah. Can we live that question as we go through? As I said, I don't have an original thought up here, guys. I believe that this is our work. I wouldn't be teaching it if I didn't believe it's our work. But it's hard work. And what you should hear is that you don't need to come out of tonight and go home and say, you've got to go forgive, you fill in the blank. It may take years, it may take a lifetime, it may not ever be possible. And don't beat yourself up on that. Know that your time to do so is one in which it's your time. And that no one else can tell you, you must go do this. That's not what I'm saying. I'm inviting you into seeing the value of doing that work, as hard as it is. Because I believe that there are gifts to be had for the one who gets released from that once they do that work. Eileen.
Yeah, in moments of great stress and pressure, people can commit acts that are very cruel and seemingly unforgivable, but normally they wouldn't do that. So, in that sense, you can forgive the person and not the act, because if he or she was under extreme pressure, they could act out in a destructive way.
Yeah. I don't know if y'all can hear Eileen, but there are occasions when people are under such great and intense pressure that they may do heinous things that they wouldn't otherwise do, and that way there's an opportunity to forgive the person but not the act, but understanding the context in which Tutu actually reflects on in more than one occasion in which, because he did the Truth and Reconciliation work not only in South Africa, but then he did it in Northern Ireland in the late 2005 or so, and he also did it in Rwanda after the genocides there. And there's another powerful story of in Rwanda in which a man with his family watching is forced by the marauders to rape his daughter and then murder his family after they've seen it. And how does he live with that? How does he forgive himself with that? How does he? So I think I'm trying to give a really rash example of how he wasn't wanting to do that. He was forced into that. Would you do it differently if you were in that set of circumstances? I don't know. Pat?
Since nobody is born cruel, evil acts are an invasion of that person by the taking over of them by the evil that's in all of us and smothering the good. So it seems to me that it is the act that is wrong. The person is forgivable. You may not be able to forgive the act, but you could forgive the person because he's a person.
Thank you. Deborah?
There were 2 points you prompted me to think of. One is that just being able to free, particularly in the situation of betrayal, I have found forgiving that person, that group, whoever, frees you to have the next relationship. So you're not carrying that in. And I think the other thing that surprised me about the walk of forgiveness was how deeply God was involved in the partnership of it. Just as lament drew him into, I give you permission to put a spotlight on my pain and surrender it to you, it causes me to ask the question, okay, so I do the forgiving. Now, how about if I seek your wisdom about who you would like me to be in relationship with? Maybe God isn't calling me to be in relationship with the people that I've had to forgive, or the person that I've had to forgive, but there's someone else that would benefit from the fruit of my healing by having me come alongside. So I think it just, at first it seems awful, and then it just seems like such a blessing to be drawn into such a deep place with God. Because I think there's a reason religious leaders are the best at speaking about the dynamic of forgiveness and the process of forgiveness. I think it's just a deeply spiritual issue.
Thank you for sharing that. So seeing no other hands, let me then say I'd like for us to have about a 10-minute conversation or so on at your tables. And you can join in together to make a forum there. But these are just 3 prompts. These may not be where you want to go at your table, but one, do you think real forgiveness is difficult, and if so, why? What are some cultural impediments to forgiveness being more accepted? What societal, institutional, communal, and individual changes could potentially shift things to become a more forgiving world? All right? So let's take about 10 minutes to talk at your table. So would anyone like to share anything from their table conversation? Would anyone like to share anything? Yes.
One of the things that I was interested in personally thinking about the third question is, and I think since it's a multi-part session, I think it perhaps we explored, is how our concept of justice fits alongside or interacts with forgiveness. Not necessarily in our concept of like incarceration or corporal punishment, but like a more disembodied idea of like what is justice and how does that fit alongside with forgiveness. So I was just interested in trying to figure out like how that's going to fit in.
Yeah, so he's asking how the notion of justice fits in with all of this, and we are going to talk more about it, but let me just say at a high level currently that there are different ways to measure justice. One is retributive justice, which is there is a punishment for every deed. That's the scorekeeping model that our culture just really thrives on. There's restorative justice, which is how can we create a societal setting in which relationships might be restored. And that's the truth and reconciliation model in practice. There are any number of ways to slice and dice both of those, but that's a dichotomy that we could think about, that forgiveness is really in the realm of restorative justice. And I would say that justice can still be preserved because there are consequences to the deed. It may not be punitive in the sense of incarceration, but everyone lives with the consequences of the wrongdoing. The victim does, of course, but the perpetrator does as well. All right, other thoughts? Yep, Catherine.
We talked at our table about how we try to get to the place of forgiving, especially when it's been deeply hurt. And we talked about the idea of trying to understand the person who has wronged us. That can be very difficult when we can't see or understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
It's one thing when you can, but when you can't,
Right.
that's really hard.
So Kathy's speaking of how do we come to understand the other person, and sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes we'll talk more about this next week, but part of the work of desiring forgiveness when we are the ones who have wronged another is to answer any question honestly that the victim is asking, including the why. Sometimes we may not know why, but we ought not to sidestep the responsibility of, well, I was high on drugs, or I was out of my mind, or that person made me really angry. All of those are projections to say I'm not really responsible. It's, I don't know why I did, and maybe it's the best that I can do. Does that make sense? So we'll talk more about that. And you guys you're driving right to the heart of the questions that make this really hard. Well, let's move on then and talk about what forgiveness is not. It is not an invitation to forget or to pretend that everything wasn't as bad as it really was, to minimize the injury or the harm. It's not an invitation to pretend the relationship is just fine. Let's just not talk about it. Anyone ever been in a situation where that's the impulse? Right? Let's just pretend that gorilla in the room is not there. It is not weakness. Anyone who works the path of forgiveness knows it is really hard work, and it's not for the faint of heart. It is much easier to hold a grudge than to do the work of forgiveness. It is not a subversion of justice, and as I mentioned a minute ago, that people are living with consequences. There may be different consequences than punitive, retributive justice system does. But, and I should say, again, the pathology of antisocial personality behavior may not be able to conceptually understand that there are consequences. May not. It's not easy. The path of forgiveness is not. It's not about denying the truth about what has happened. So that's what forgiveness is not. But forgiveness is acknowledging the perpetrator's humanity, even when they didn't act very humanely. I apologize again for not showing up there. It's about claiming the shared humanity that we have. It's about finding healing and peace in the process of that work. I'll skip to the last one. What does it mean to let go? What does letting go really mean? And then in Tutu's dialect, Josha means peace. And when he is engaging the work of forgiveness, when he's thinking, I want to forgive, or I want to be forgiven, the language is, I don't know how to pronounce it, indicil exolo, which means I want peace. I ask for peace. Peace is the language of forgiveness. They're interbound, they're interwoven. All right? So here's the teaser, and we'll unpack this a whole lot more next week. This is that fourfold path that Tutu and others propose, which is an invitation to move from the left side wheel to the right side. Let me just walk through it. We start with the experience of violence or cruelty or betrayal or a breach of trust, which triggers a harm or a loss, experience of loss. And let me just say, anytime there is loss, there is grief. And so part of this is the work of grief. We'll talk more about that either next week or the week after. So we experience the harm or the loss, which triggers pain. And the pain, our habituated practice as humans is to try to inflict pain back as a way to relieve the pain that we experience. But in fact, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't, in the infliction of the pain to the other, it doesn't relieve the pain for us. Or if it does, it's only transient. The satisfaction that comes with revenge or retaliation is momentary. The invitation is, and let me just work on around, it is about rejecting the shared humanity. That person has done me so wrong, there is nothing in common, and I want to cause them harm. Which then gets to the revenge and retaliation, which causes more violence, which causes more hurt, which causes more pain. You see the cycle. Do you see this playing out in the world today? I mean, it's played out at international level. It's played out in the political setting. It's played out in churches. I mean, I've heard, I've known churches to be just so deeply seated in how we end up hurting one another, and that's the motivation for what we do. I'm grateful that this church is not in that sort of a cycle at this point. The opportunity is to acknowledge the pain as very real, to name the hurt as very real, and then to tell the story. And this moves over to this opportunity to forgive. We must tell the story. We must tell it honestly. We must name the hurt. We must recognize the shared humanity that enables us to see, can there be relationship out of this, renewed or released in a way that provides healing and peace. So that's the path of forgiveness. Any questions or thoughts about that? Ben?
See, why the cycle? After we tell a story, name the hurt, recognize humanity, we release the relationship, are we not done?
Yeah, it may be that you're done with one instance, but if you're going to be in a relationship, you're going to experience the opportunity for forgiveness again.
So especially for like ongoing relationships. But if it's a one-time situation, it might not be as.
It might not be. That's right. Yeah. All right. Other thoughts? All right. So, as I said, this is not for the faint of heart. It means that we do not deny the pain. And we are taught culturally, deny the pain, blunt the pain, medicate the pain, refuse to acknowledge the pain. But this is the work of saying, no, this was wrong, this hurt. I am hurting. And to be honest with that, which means that in that loss that there is grief, and we've got to be willing to hold that grief as well. The lament, back to Brueggemann's comment, is that we've got to be honest in our ability to lament the situation as it is and demand that something must be different, or expect that something must be different. And that God, as Deborah said, God can be and is in that. How long does this path take? And what I would say, as I said earlier, is be gentle with yourself. There is no set timeline. There is no magic to this level of hurt will take this long and this level of hurt will take that long. It's not necessarily cyclical in the way that it's described there diagrammatically. It may be that we have to go back and tell the story a second or a third or an 18th time for us to understand it in a way that we can move on through. Or that we have to sit with the pain in a way that we can make sense of it to work on through. Does this make sense? Yeah. So be gentle with yourself. Work it in your heart before you go try to engage the person who's harming you. Obviously, the opportunity in the ideal is to be able to have that conversation directly in a safe way. But that's not always possible. Sometimes it's not safe. Sometimes the person's dead. Sometimes you don't even know who it was that did it. But absent that, there can be some proxies. We'll talk more next week. Writing letters. There are actually websites and hotlines that are directed toward forgiveness. And you work it out with a counselor on the phone, or you write it onto a blog. We'll share that more next week. Don't jump into a situation that can be risky to you, in other words, right? All right, so let's spend a little time now breaking into groups of 2, or if you need to, 3 will be okay. But maybe before you start talking, write a few notes, jot a few notes in your margin, thinking of an experience in which you were the one who wronged another and needed to be forgiven. You'll have time in our homework, you'll have time to write about the experiences of being victimized. But for this purpose, think about a time that you needed to be forgiven. And think about how you felt in that situation. Think about, did you ask for forgiveness? Was it granted? Were you both honest in acknowledging the pain and hurt? How did you remember it? How do you remember it even now? How is the relationship different now in the wake of that experience? All just prompt questions for you. Spend about 3 minutes or so just jotting some thoughts to yourself. And then when I say commence the conversations, then pair up, and we'll spend about 12 or 15 minutes in that. Okay? Anyone would like to share anything that we talked about? Any learnings, gleanings?
I won't go into the details of the story, but many years ago, I heard somebody, I was extremely insulting to them, and I was extremely fortunate that they called it out in meeting, and and I woke as from a stupor. I realized in that moment that I had not been recognizing that person's shared humanity. And I didn't realize I was not recognizing their shared humanity. And it was a shock to me to recognize that I could so easily, from my point of view, forget or omit or fail to recognize someone's shared humanity. I thought better of myself. I thought, oh, I'm not the kind of person who would do that. Oh no, I definitely was, and I didn't know it. And that person and I actually did not speak after that day. We parted ways amicably. I asked for forgiveness, and he granted it. But I remember him to this day, and will all my life, with gratitude, because he did a couple things. He gave me the chance to ask for forgiveness. He granted it. And he also gave me the chance to see myself better and what I was capable of. And I think he helped everyone else I've interacted with since, right? Even if they don't know it.
Yeah.
Everyone I know has benefited from him really being honest and doing the good work of telling me I was awful.
Why is it that, thank you for sharing that, Phil. Why is it that we are so reluctant to be really honest with one another? I call it the immunities of indirection. Yeah, Brady?
That piece in the process where you have to actually acknowledge your pain, which means you have to feel it. So to tell somebody that they hurt you means you have to feel that hurt.
Yeah. Were y'all able to hear? So in order to acknowledge the pain, in order to be honest, you have to acknowledge the pain, and so that's the work that we don't like to do, understandably. Yeah. Lynn?
Just to piggyback on what Regis said, and if they don't choose to change, or again, you told them that they hurt you, and they don't choose to change, then you have a decision to make. Whether or not you want to stay in a relationship with them.
So if they don't choose to change, then you have a decision to make whether to stay in a relationship or not.
Or it lets you know how much you're not valued, and if that's some of us who drive around on these things.
Yeah.
Some of the time.
Yeah, which gets to a whole nother area of the work that we have is how do we gauge our own self-worth and our esteem based on what other people think of us.
Which is, I think, when you were talking about, people working your heart first, I think that's really important, because if you're still dependent on what the other person thinks, then you're not really free for people. That you can't get in there and say, and say, okay, well, even if you don't change, it doesn't matter at this point.
Yeah. It's about the work you need to do.
Yes, it's about my relinquishing the pain and hurt that I feel, and letting the other person be themselves, and realizing they may not have been who I thought they were, but that doesn't define me.
Thank you for that. Others?
And I think you risk rejection from that person that you're in tandem with. And it also tears in a bigger way at the society by the tribe surviving. That if I get rejected, in a way, so what? But if I fall apart as part of the warp and weave of society, then it frays, the society frays.
Yeah.
F-R-A-Y-S.
So we put ourselves at risk of rejection if we engage honestly. But then Sandra's just really struck on a really important element of all of this that I haven't really named yet, and that is that when we talk about renewing or releasing a relationship as if it's between two individuals, the social reality of our existence is one in which there are many other people who are impacted by whatever the wrong was, by whatever the pain is, by whatever the opportunity for forgiveness is as well. So there's a risk of the fraying of the society or of the community depending on how that goes. But there's also the opportunity for healing for the broader community by virtue of the work that two people do. Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah. Penny?
I had a chance to share something with someone that I'm a good friend with Susan, and I realized that I shared something that I hadn't shared with anybody else. And that it was, I almost describe it as unforgivable, something I did was unforgivable, and tapped into hurt in her life too. And that both of us made some attempt to defend what the other had done. I was young. I heard my friend say, well, you were young. And I was just thinking, my experience listening to Susan was, maybe it started as defending her, you know, in what she was working with, but it was also compassion. You know, like, oh, it just, I felt defending her in a way, but also, oh, you know, I think you did the best you could. You know, I wonder if you could hear that, if how you can tell people that in a way, or how we can tell ourselves that in a way that allows us to forgive ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, that yes, what I did was unforgivable. On the other hand, here I've told somebody that finally.
Yeah.
And the very same thing hurt her very much in her life, you know, that I just, it's sort of extraordinary really, just the act of putting voice to something that I consider, that I acted the way I acted, that I consider unforgivable, you know, I consider it bad. Yeah, anyway, that there is, I will ponder that.
Yeah. I hope, were you all able to hear what Penny was saying? Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And
do you have a comment about the difference between defending and being compassionate?
So
there's a different feeling.
So with no judgment about what you were describing in that exchange that you and Susan had, what I would say generally is when we are deflecting, it might be out of compassion and ameliorating, holding the pain with the person. It could also be that we're wanting to suppress the pain. Let's not hold that pain. Let's just put it away.
Yeah.
And I mean, that would be natural enough for us to want to do with someone whom we care for, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's that.
Mm-hmm.
But compassion is a really important piece of this. And as we talk about ways that we work it through in our heart, but then we may want to try it on with someone whom we really trust before we go try it on with the person whom we really need to address in terms of the forgiveness. It may be that it's a trusted friend or a partner or a counselor or someone that we can try that on. See how it feels to work through it. Mary?
When Cinderella and I were talking, we both got into situations where we had some kind of expectation of what the exchange would be. So maybe we asked for forgiveness and that's not the response. Or maybe we try to make amends and the making amends is not received or not acknowledged. And so I think a hard part of seeking forgiveness is recognizing that you can say whatever you want. It doesn't govern what the other person will do and say.
Right. Be able to hear that we own our work and we can't control what the other does. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you all for sharing and for the work of engagement. Next week we will unpack that fourfold path in much more detail, and many of you have hit on elements that we'll get down into the great detail next week. What I would like to challenge you to consider doing, though, between now and next week is for your own benefit and for no one else's eyes, unless you choose to share, journal about a time when you were betrayed or were hurt by another and whether or how forgiveness was given by you. And then also journal about those who you need to forgive and about those whom you would like to ask for forgiveness. How would you go about that? Make a list of people. Who in your life is a part of the work that you're being asked to consider in this? Does that make sense? So, any other thoughts before we conclude with a prayer? Seeing none, let us pray. Gracious God, it is with a sense of your presence that we joined here this evening and engage this deep work of forgiveness, trusting that you are calling us into it. You are eternally modeling it for us and with us. And you, so deeply seated in our spirits and in our beings, have given us the full gift and grace and capacity to go about this work with a measure of tenderness for ourselves, a measure of acknowledging our shared humanity with those who have hurt us, and with a deep sense of community that we do not have to go about this journey alone. But we have one another. We have your Son, our Savior, and we have your love guiding us on and behind. For that, we give you thanks this night. Amen. Thank you all. Same time next week.